The year is 1960. The location is the high Arctic, a desolate expanse of blinding white nothingness, where the temperature routinely plunges to 60 degrees below zero. To the human eye, the Greenland ice sheet is the most inhospitable place on Earth, a frozen graveyard where life is impossible. But to the strategic planners inside the Kremlin, staring at their maps in the dim light of a Moscow war room, this frozen wasteland is the most terrifying geography on the planet. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on distance as its primary defense. The Atlantic Ocean was a moat, the European continent was a buffer zone. But the Arctic changed the geometry of war. Looking down from the top of the globe, the distance between the Soviet Union and the United States vanishes. It is the shortest route for a bomber and the deadliest path for a missile. In the winter of 1960, Soviet intelligence began receiving reports that made no sense. They were monitoring the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, watching the flow of American naval traffic. Usually, the patterns were predictable. Supply ships went to known bases in West Germany, the United Kingdom, or Iceland. But suddenly, there was a diversion. Massive cargo vessels, heavy with construction materials, steel beams, and nuclear reactor components, were heading north. Further north than any major military base required, they were docking at the edge of the Greenland ice shelf, offloading thousands of tons of equipment, and then nothing. The cargo simply vanished. Soviet reconnaissance assets strained to find the destination. High-altitude overflights and early surveillance efforts scoured the white expanse of the ice cap. They expected to see the sprawl of a new airbase, the dark tarmac of runways cutting through the snow, or the concrete hardened structures of radar installations. They found nothing, just the endless, undulating white waves of the ice sheet. This was an impossibility. You cannot hide 10,000 tons of steel on the surface of a glacier. You cannot erase a military complex from the face of the Earth. Yet, the Americans were pouring resources into a black hole in the ice. The GRU, the Soviet military intelligence, was paralyzed by confusion. Was it a glitch in their logistics tracking? Were the Americans building a base that was somehow camouflaged to look exactly like the surrounding snow? Or were they witnessing a phantom operation, a logistical sleight of hand designed to make the Kremlin waste resources hunting for a base that did not exist? The reports coming back to Moscow described convoys of heavy tractors crawling onto the ice and driving into the blinding horizon, never to return. It was as if the Earth itself was swallowing the United States Army. The confusion inside the Soviet High Command was not just about the missing cargo, it was about the silence. There were no radio transmissions indicating a large garrison. There were no heat signatures consistent with a sprawling surface city. The Americans were operating in one of the deadliest environments known to man, yet they had left no footprint. Subscribe to Cold War Impact for more stories of the hidden battles that defined our world. The confusion quickly curdled into fear. In the paranoia of the Cold War, an unexplained event was always treated as a worst-case scenario. The Soviet strategists knew that if the Americans could successfully militarize the Greenland ice sheet, the strategic balance of the world would shatter. A bomber taking off from Greenland could reach the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union in hours. A missile launched from the ice could strike Moscow before the Soviet leadership even had time to pick up the red phone. The stakes were existential. The Kremlin had spent billions of rubles constructing a wall of radar and air defense systems along their borders, expecting attacks to come from the sky. But this new anomaly suggested a threat that bypassed their understanding of warfare. If the Americans were there, hiding in the blind spot of the Arctic, they were already inside the Soviet defense perimeter. The mystery deepened as the months rolled on. Soviet listening posts began to pick up seismic vibrations, faint, rhythmic tremors radiating through the ice shelf. It wasn't the chaotic rumbling of shifting glaciers or icequakes. It was mechanical. It was steady. It sounded like the heartbeat of a massive industrial organism, living where no organism could survive. Panic began to set in within the highest levels of the Soviet Defense Ministry. They were looking at a map that told them they were safe, but the data was screaming that they were vulnerable. The enemy was doing something impossible. They were building something invisible. And whatever it was getting bigger, louder, and more entrenched with every passing day. The Soviet military machine was built to fight tanks and planes, but it had no doctrine for fighting ghosts in the ice. They needed answers, and they needed them before the ice shelf turned into a launch pad for World War III. The order that descended from the Kremlin was absolute. Find the Phantom. The Soviet leadership could not tolerate a blind spot of this magnitude. If the Americans were staging a strategic asset in Greenland, the Soviet Union needed coordinates. They needed a target package for their R-7 missiles. They needed to know exactly what was buried in the ice, so they could calculate the megatonnage required to vaporize it. The investigation began with a frenzy of signal interception. The Soviet Navy dispatched its fleet of fishing trawlers, heavily modified intelligence, gathering vessels bristling with antennas disguised as nets and rigging to the waters off the coast of Greenland. These ships, known as AGI vessels, parked themselves in the freezing swells of Baffin Bay, aiming their high-gain receivers at the blank expanse of the ice cap. They were listening for the chatter of a military base, the squawk of ground control, the hum of radar arrays, the routine, unencrypted communication of bored soldiers. But the ice played tricks on them. The Greenland ice sheet is miles thick in places, a chaotic mass of frozen water that distorts and absorbs radio waves. The Soviet radio operators, wearing heavy headsets in the cramped, swaying cabins of their trawlers, heard only ghost signals. They picked up bursts of static that sounded like encrypted data streams, only for them to dissolve into atmospheric noise. Occasionally, they would catch a snatch of a voice, an American accent, clear and close, and then it would vanish, as if the speaker had stepped into a void. It was maddening. The electronic signature of the target was inconsistent with any known military doctrine. A standard airbase radiates electromagnetic energy like a beacon, this target whispered. Frustrated by the lack of electronic intelligence, the Soviets turned to the sky. This was the dawn of the spy satellite era. The Soviet Union retasked its early Zenit reconnaissance satellites to sweep over the coordinates where the convoys had been seen disappearing. These cameras, orbiting over 100 miles above the Earth, were designed to spot tanks in a desert or aircraft carriers in a harbor. The analysts in Moscow waited anxiously for the film canisters to be ejected from orbit, recovered, and developed. When the wet, glossy prints were finally laid out on the light tables in the GRU headquarters, the room fell silent. They saw nothing. The photograph showed an endless, blinding white canvas. There were no runways. There were no control towers. There were no barracks. There were faint, jagged lines that might have been tire tracks, but they led nowhere, ending abruptly as if the vehicles had simply evaporated. The analysts used magnifying loupes, scanning every grain of the film for the shadow of a structure. They looked for the telltale geometric shapes of man-made objects against the organic chaos of the snow. But the camouflage was perfect because the camouflage was the landscape itself. This lack of visual confirmation birthed a dangerous legend inside the Soviet military apparatus. The Greenland anomaly transformed from a tactical puzzle into a technological bogeyman. In the absence of facts, paranoia filled the void. Intelligence reports began to circulate suggesting that the Americans had developed a technology the Soviets could not replicate, a way to exist beneath the ice without fighting the glacier. Soviet glaciologists were brought in for consultation, and they were baffled. They explained to the generals that the ice cap was not a solid block of stone, it was a slow-moving river. It flowed, cracked, and shifted constantly. Building a permanent structure inside it was considered engineering suicide. Any tunnels would be crushed by the immense pressure of the shifting ice within months. The walls would close in, the ceilings would collapse. To the Soviet scientific consensus, what the Americans were seemingly doing was physically impossible. This led to the wrong conclusions. The Soviet strategists, unable to accept that the Americans had mastered the physics of the ice, began to construct elaborate, incorrect theories to explain the data. One prevailing theory was that the activity in Greenland was a massive decoy operation. The generals argued that the Americans were sending convoys into the ice to dump scrap metal and empty crates, creating a heat sink to confuse Soviet sensors, while the real base was hidden somewhere else, perhaps in the rocky fjords of the coast. They wasted precious resources scouring the coastlines, ignoring the center of the ice cap, convinced that no sane military planner would put a nuclear asset in a shifting glacier. Another, darker theory gained traction within the KGB. They speculated that the Americans weren't building a base at all, but a weapon of environmental warfare. There were whispers that the seismic tremors they were detecting weren't from construction but from testing. Was it possible the Americans were drilling deep shafts to plant nuclear devices at the base of the ice sheet? A coordinated detonation could shear off massive sections of the shelf, causing catastrophic tsunamis or altering global weather patterns. It sounded like science fiction, but in the fever pitch of the 1960s, the boundary between science and weaponization was blurring. The Soviet investigation became a hunt for a phantom. They tracked heat plumes that turned out to be pressurized steam venting from the ice, an impossibility in nature, yet they couldn't find the source. They tracked low-frequency vibrations that sounded like massive diesel engines running 24 hours a day, buried hundreds of feet down. The confusion reached its peak when a Soviet Tu-16 bomber, modified for reconnaissance, flew a daring sortie over the suspected area. The crew reported seeing lights under the ice. Not on the surface, but a diffuse, ghostly glow emanating from deep beneath the snowpack, visible only in the perpetual twilight of the Arctic winter. It looked like a city was glowing through a translucent shroud. The pilot's report was classified top secret immediately. It terrified the command. Lights meant habitation. Habitation meant a garrison. And a garrison meant the Americans were not just visiting the ice. They were living inside it. They had hollowed out the glacier and built a fortress that was impervious to observation. But the Soviet military mind could not comprehend the scale. They imagined a small, cramped bunker, perhaps a listening post for a few dozen men. They assumed it was a static, miserable hole in the ground. They could not conceive that the seismic rumbles they were hearing were not just generators, but the sounds of a nuclear reactor. They could not imagine that the Americans had built a fully functioning town, complete with a cinema, a chapel, and laboratories, powered by the atom, drifting slowly with the flow of the ice. The Soviets concluded they were facing a new type of fortification, a cryo-bunker. They assumed its purpose was defensive, a survival shelter for the American elite in the event of nuclear war. They marked the coordinates as a hardened target and assigned multiple megatons of nuclear ordnance to the empty patch of snow, hoping that raw power would dig out whatever the Americans had buried. They were wrong. It wasn't a shelter, it wasn't a decoy, and it certainly wasn't defensive. While the Soviets stared at the white surface, trying to understand how a bunker could survive the crushing pressure, they missed the true horror of the project. They missed the tunnels that were far longer and far wider than anything a simple bunker would require. They missed the reality that the city wasn't the point. The city was just the support structure. The true secret was the weapon the city was built to service. The Soviets were hunting for a hideout, but the Americans were building a launch pad. While the Kremlin chased phantoms and their pilots hunted for mysterious lights in the polar darkness, the United States Army Corps of Engineers was busy rewriting the laws of physics and architecture. They were not building a bunker. They were not building a decoy. Deep beneath the surface of the Greenland ice cap, they had successfully constructed the first nuclear-powered city in human history. They called it Camp Century. The project began in 1959, driven by a vision that was equal parts brilliance and madness. The American strategic planners realized that the Arctic was not just a barrier, it was a sanctuary. If they could figure out how to live inside the ice, rather than on top of it, they would possess the ultimate camouflage. The ice would protect them from the elements, and more importantly, it would hide them from the prying eyes of Soviet satellites. The construction of Camp Century was a feat of engineering that rivaled the pyramids, but it was achieved with Swiss precision and American industrial muscle. The engineers didn't dig tunnels, they milled them. They imported massive rotary snowmilling machines from Switzerland, known as Peter plows. These behemoths, with cutting wheels the size of a man, chewed through the hardened fern, the dense, compacted snow that forms the upper layer of the glacier, ejecting great arcs of white powder high into the air. The method was known as cut and cover. The plows carved deep, wide trenches into the surface of the ice sheet, some as long as 1,000 feet. Once the trenches were dug, the soldiers lowered massive arches made of corrugated steel into the chasm. These were the roofs of the city. Once the arches were secured, the snow was blown back over the top, burying the structures instantly. As the Arctic winds howled and the snow drifted, the surface healed itself. Within weeks, the roof of the city was indistinguishable from the rest of the desolate ice cap. The city had vanished, but underneath that frozen ceiling, a miracle of logistics was taking shape. Inside the steel tunnels, the Americans built a fully functioning town. There were heated barracks made of prefabricated plywood modules, suspended from the ceiling to minimize contact with the shifting ice floor. There was a cafeteria serving hot steak and fresh coffee. There was a library, a hobby shop, a movie theater showing the latest Hollywood releases, and even a chapel with an altar carved from ice. The soldiers lived in a perpetual, comfortable twilight, walking along wooden boardwalks that connected the modules, protected from the lethal 60 below zero winds raging just 40 feet above their heads. The most audacious component of Camp Century, however, was its heart. To survive in the Arctic, you need heat and power, and you need a lot of it. Relying on diesel generators would have required a logistical chain of fuel tankers that was impossible to maintain in the winter blizzards. So, the Americans did the unthinkable. They brought the atomic age to the ice age. They deployed the PM2 Amperes, a portable nuclear reactor designed specifically for this mission. It was a marvel of miniaturization, shipped in pieces by heavy transport planes and assembled deep within the glacier. When the control rods were pulled and the reactor went critical in 1960, Camp Century became self-sufficient. It was a nuclear-powered bubble of warmth in the coldest place on Earth. The steam from the reactor melted deep wells into the glacier to provide fresh water, and the excess heat kept the tunnels at a livable temperature. To the soldiers stationed there, it was a triumph of American comfort and ingenuity. But to the generals at the Pentagon, Camp Century was merely a proof of concept. The city under the ice was the cover story. The scientific research into ice cores and weather patterns was real. But it was also the perfect alibi. The true purpose of the project was a classified operation known as Project Iceworm. Camp Century was the prototype for a much larger, darker ambition. The plan was to expand the tunnel network from a few thousand feet to over 2,500 miles. The Army intended to build a subterranean subway system beneath the Greenland ice sheet, covering an area of 52,000 square miles, roughly 3 times the size of Denmark. Inside these tunnels, the US would deploy a fleet of 600 Iceman nuclear missiles, modified versions of the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile. These missiles would be mounted on specialized trains, constantly moving through the frozen labyrinth. They would never stop in one place for long. They would glide silently through the dark tunnels, stopping only at pre-designated launch points to await orders. This was the solution to the missile gap that terrified American planners. Fixed missile silos in North Dakota or Montana were sitting ducks. The Soviets knew exactly where they were. But a missile moving constantly beneath a mile of ice? It was invulnerable. It was invisible. If the Soviets launched a first strike, they would hit nothing but snow. The Project Iceworm trains would simply move to a new tunnel section, raise their launchers through the ice roof, and retaliate. It was the ultimate second strike weapon. The plan called for thousands of missiles to be aimed directly at the Soviet Union from a range so short that the Kremlin would have virtually no warning time. The audacity of the plan highlighted the sheer scale of American dominance in the early 1960s. While the Soviets were struggling to miniaturize their warheads and keep their own submarines from sinking, the United States was planning to carve a continent-sized weapon out of a living glacier. They had solved the logistics of nuclear power in the Arctic. They had solved the psychology of isolation. They had turned the most hostile environment on Earth into a forward operating base. As the scientists drilled their ice cores and the soldiers watched movies in the warm glow of the reactor, the Pentagon began drawing up the blueprints for the full expansion. They believed they had conquered nature. They believed they had built the perfect weapon. They had created a secret world that the Soviets couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't destroy. The Phantom the Soviets were hunting wasn't a glitch. It was a loaded gun, pointed directly at Moscow, buried in a place where no one thought a gun could exist. The Americans felt invincible. They had beaten the Russians to the punch, and they had beaten the elements. Or so they thought. The breakthrough for the Soviet intelligence apparatus did not come from a spy in a trench coat, nor from a daring aerial reconnaissance mission. It came from a movie projector. In an act of supreme confidence, or perhaps arrogance, the United States Army decided to hide their secret in plain sight. To justify the massive expenditure of Camp Century to the American taxpayer, they produced a slick, publicly released documentary titled The City Under the Ice. It was framed as a triumph of peaceful polar science, a testament to man's ability to conquer the elements for the sake of research. When a copy of this film reached Moscow in the early 1960s, it was not screened in a cinema, but in a secured briefing room inside the Kremlin. The generals and intelligence analysts watched in silence as the grainy black and white footage played. They saw the smiling American soldiers. They saw the library. They saw the chaplain conducting services. It looked like a Boy Scout adventure. But the Soviet analysts were not looking at the smiles. They were looking at the infrastructure. They paused the film. They rewound. They zoomed in on the background details that the American censors had left in. They measured the width of the tunnels based on the height of the soldiers standing in them. They analyzed the thickness of the steel arches. And most critically, they stared at the footage of the PM2 amperes nuclear reactor being lowered into the ice. The shock moment hit the room like a physical blow. The specific, horrifying realization wasn't just that the Americans were there, it was that they had solved the energy equation. By placing a nuclear reactor inside the glacier, the Americans had removed the only tether holding them back, the need for fuel lines. A nuclear-powered base could operate indefinitely. It could support not just 100 men, but thousands. It could power not just lights, but heavy industrial machinery and missile launch systems. The Soviet strategic rocket forces did the math instantly. If the Americans could build a tunnel 20 feet wide, they could build a tunnel 30 feet wide. If they could keep a base stable for a year, they could keep it stable forever. The science station cover story evaporated. The Soviets realized they were looking at the prototype for a subterranean missile continent. The realization provoked a sense of vertigo in the Soviet command. They looked at their maps of the Arctic and realized the white space was no longer empty. It was a loaded weapon. The concept of Project Iceworm, though they may not have known the code name, was now conceptually visible to them. They understood that the Americans intended to place missiles on mobile platforms under the ice, creating a shell game that Soviet targeting computers could never win. The response from the Kremlin was frantic and ultimately futile. They ordered the development of fractional orbital bombardment systems, FOBs, missiles that could fly the long way around the Earth, attacking the US from the south to avoid the Greenland early warning radars. They accelerated the production of their own immense, heavy ICBMs, the R-36, hoping to simply overwhelm the American defenses with raw tonnage. They even considered the maddest countermeasure of all, nuking the ice cap. Soviet war planners ran simulations on what it would take to destroy the tunnel network. The results were disheartening. To crush the tunnels, they would have to carpet bomb the entire Greenland ice sheet with high-yield nuclear weapons. The fallout would poison half of the northern hemisphere, including the Soviet Union itself. The ice was a shield that absorbed shockwaves. The Americans had built a fortress that could not be destroyed without destroying the world. For a brief window in history, the Soviet Union believed they had lost the Cold War. They believed the Americans had achieved the ultimate strategic high ground. The mood in Moscow was one of grim resignation. They were checkmated by a city buried in the snow. But then, the twist arrived. It didn't come from Soviet countermeasures. It came from the ice itself. While the Soviets were paralyzed by the threat of Camp Century, the Americans were beginning to panic inside it. The perfect weapon was failing. The arrogance of the engineers had run headlong into the reality of glaciology. The premise of Camp Century relied on the assumption that the ice moved slowly and predictably. They were wrong. The Greenland ice sheet is a living, viscoelastic fluid. It flows like incredibly slow molasses. And it was hungry. By 1962, the walls of Camp Century were beginning to close in. The massive trenches which had been cut with such precision were deforming. The ceiling was lowering. The steel arches were groaning under millions of tons of pressure. The perfectly straight tunnels began to twist and buckle. The horror shifted from the Soviet war room to the American commander's office. The nuclear reactor, the heart of the base, was in danger. If the ice crushed the containment vessel, they would cause a nuclear disaster that would permanently contaminate the pristine Arctic environment and create an international incident of catastrophic proportions. The soldiers spent their days frantically shaving ice off the walls with chainsaws, fighting a losing battle against the crushing weight of the glacier. The floors heaved upwards. The barracks tilted. The city under the ice was being chewed up and digested by the planet. The futile response of the Soviets building bigger bombs and orbital missiles became ironic. They were arming themselves against a threat that was already dying. The Americans realized that Project Iceworm was physically impossible. They couldn't build a subway for missiles because the tracks would warp within weeks, the trains would derail, the missiles would be crushed in their tubes. The invincible fortress was a death trap. Nature had done what the KGB and the Red Army could not. It defeated the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The end of the dream did not come with a bang, but with a quiet, hasty retreat. By 1966, the battle against the ice was lost. The nuclear reactor, the crown jewel of the project, was disassembled and airlifted out. The heavy machinery was stripped. But the shell of the city, the tunnels, the barracks, the sewage tanks, and the thousands of gallons of diesel fuel was left behind. The soldiers turned off the lights, climbed out of the trenches, and let the snow bury their creation. The verdict on Project Iceworm is defined by a single crushing statistic. The glacier was moving at a rate of nearly 4 feet per month. The engineers had calculated a lifespan of 10 years for the base. Nature gave them barely 5. The entire project, which had consumed millions of dollars and the attention of the world's superpowers, was crushed by the slow, inexorable grind of the Earth. The missile trains that were supposed to guarantee American dominance never launched a single warhead. The ultimate weapon was defeated not by a Soviet interceptor, but by the viscosity of water. However, the failure of Project Iceworm reveals a deeper truth about the Cold War. It exposes the terrifying asymmetry of fear that defined the era. For years, the Soviet Union was paralyzed by the existence of this base. They warped their own economy and military doctrine to counter a threat that was literally collapsing on its own. They built interceptors to shoot down ghosts. They spent billions on radar systems to scan for missiles that were rusting in crushed tunnels. This is the macro theme of the conflict, the power of the unknown. The Cold War was often less about the weapons that actually worked and more about the weapons the enemy thought you had. The United States projected an image of omnipotence, a nation so advanced it could colonize the ice, and the Soviets believed it because they were terrified of falling behind. It was a psychological victory for America, even if it was a tactical failure. It forced the Soviets to realize that there was nowhere on Earth, not even the frozen wasteland of Greenland, where they were safe from American reach. But the story of Camp Century does not end in 1966. The legacy of the city under the ice is not just a footnote in a military history book. It is a ticking time bomb, ticking in the 21st century. When the US Army abandoned the base, they did so under the assumption that the ice would preserve it forever. They believed the snow would continue to accumulate, burying the waste deeper and deeper, entombing the radioactive coolant, the polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and the sewage in a frozen sarcophagus for eternity. It was the ultimate out of sight, out of mind solution. They did not account for climate change. Today, the Arctic is warming at double the rate of the rest of the planet. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. The pristine white surface that hid the base for 60 years is thinning. Scientists estimate that within the next few decades, the toxic corpse of Camp Century will be exposed to the open air. The ghost is coming back. This creates a modern diplomatic nightmare. Who is responsible for the cleanup? The United States? Who built it? Or Denmark, who technically owns the land but was kept in the dark about the nuclear missiles? The secret city has become a poisoned inheritance, a physical manifestation of the mess the Cold War left behind. In the end, the Greenland anomaly stands as a monument to human hubris. We looked at the most hostile environment on the planet and thought we could tame it with steel and atoms. We thought we could hide the machinery of death inside the beauty of the ice. The Soviets were horrified by what they thought was American genius. The Americans were humbled by the reality of nature. And now, the ice is receding, ready to return what was hidden. The mystery of the 1960s has been solved, but the price is still being paid.